Of all the orchestration books I've ever seen, by far the most detailed is the Koechlin treatise de l'Orchestration. It's in 4 volumes, over 1,400 pages long, has thousands of musical examples. Here's a typical page. Koechlin was a French composer and teacher. He lived from 1867 to 1950. He studied composition with Fauré and was the orchestrator for Fauré's Pelléas et Mélisande suite. He was also a prolific composer himself in various different styles. Among his important students were Germaine Taillefer, Roger Desornières, Francis Poulenc, Henri Sauget, and Cole Porter. Darius Milhaud, while not a formal student, considered Koechlin a significant influence. Koechlin wrote multiple textbooks on harmony, counterpoint, fugue, and orchestration, all of which are among the best ever written. He was a very generous teacher, always aiming at the clearest and most detailed explanations possible, with many examples. In the next few lessons, I'll look at his orchestration treatise in some detail, emphasizing things he discusses that I've never seen mentioned anywhere else. The first volume starts with detailed discussions of the individual instruments, including the human voice. As an example, the chapter on the horn is 26 pages long, includes a detailed discussion of natural horn, even including things like a list of trills it can play. Then he moves on to the modern horn, with dozens of examples from the repertoire and details about passage work and fingering. He even mentions which trills are harder and explains why. In the chapter on the human voice, which is more than 30 pages long, he goes into detail about the various kinds of solo voices in terms of character. For example, for solo soprano voice, he lists dramatic soprano, what he calls the sustained soprano that we see in comic opera, coloratura soprano, and the second sustained soprano with a range smaller than the first one. He also discusses children's voices. Each of these is explained in detail and with repertoire examples. He discusses the difference between chest voice and head voice for male singers. There follows a discussion of what makes a good vocal phrase and many repertoire examples. After that, there are detailed discussions with many examples again of vocal ranges, of vocalises, of the various articulations possible for the voice, of intonation difficulties, of pronunciation, and also of choral voices. In the chapter on string instruments, once again, he discusses the technique of each instrument in great detail, including the various ways each instrument can be used in the orchestra, supported by numerous repertoire examples. The first section closes with a discussion of older instruments no longer in common use. Since this book was written in the 1940s, some more recent special effects are not mentioned, but the detail that is included surpasses anything I've ever seen elsewhere. Also, each instrument is discussed from a musical point of view, rather than just giving an abstract list of effects. After this, there's a chapter on orchestral balance, more than 100 pages long. Koechlin begins with an important distinction, something I've never seen elsewhere, between loudness and what he calls volume. In English, we translate the latter as the thickness of the sound. For example, if a horn and a violin each played middle C, quietly, the horn would just sound fatter than the violin, not louder. In orchestration, this is very important because it's so clearly audible. For example, imagine a large tutti passage followed by a high oboe solo. The oboe already sounds very thin in its high register. After a tutti, it would sound even thinner by contrast with the full sound of the whole orchestra. A lovely example, cited by Koechlin, is from Debussy's Nuage, where one flute is accompanied by a full muted string ensemble, where the violins are in the same register as the flute. But the flute still stands out because its sound is rounder than the strings. In this regard, he also discusses orchestral dialogues, for example, between a small wind ensemble and violins, at the same dynamic nuance. One reason these dialogues are so effective is because of the difference between the volume of the winds and the strings. After explaining this distinction between loudness and volume, Koechlin goes on to discuss planes of tone, foreground, background, accompaniment, and so on. Too many orchestration books never mention this at all, but it's a fundamental concept in orchestration. Without it, you really can't write effectively at all for the orchestra. Then he goes on to distinguish between simultaneous balance, instruments playing at the same time, and successive balance, as in the example I mentioned above, of a solo oboe followed by a tutti. When discussing simultaneous balance, he goes through each orchestral family individually. For example, in the case of wind instruments, they are not all equal. It depends on register and the kind of figuration. In the case of the brass, the horns aren't always equal to the heavy brass. The next section goes into the balance between orchestral families, both at the same dynamics and at different dynamics. He gives examples of foreground planes in various families combined with background in others. This is a complicated subject and there's a lot to say about it. He also includes examples with voice, a special case that will merit later on a whole chapter by itself in Volume 4. He also discusses the effect of various articulations and different kinds of figuration on balance. There follows a discussion of doubling between families as well as balance between all the main orchestral families when playing together. This includes examples and explanations including percussion, piano, and harp as well. After looking at all these situations in detail, we begin the section about successive balance. If you listen to a lot of orchestral music, you'll notice how, at times when a loud tutti is followed by a quiet answer, the first few notes of the quiet answer are barely audible. It takes a moment for our ears to adjust to the big contrast, so it may be necessary to double the quiet instrument for a while. Here again, Koechlin goes into all the various combinations individually, including discussion of crescendos and diminuendos. Next, there's a detailed discussion of unequal balance, for example in accompaniment passages. It includes a table of which families can play the loudest and the softest in the whole orchestra, as well as for individual wind instruments in various registers. An interesting section follows about very quiet and very loud passages. The last section in this chapter goes into what instruments and combinations stand out and which become background when playing together. All these subjects are elaborated with dozens of examples. One would think that somebody who knows all this would already be a master orchestrator, but this is just the first volume of 4. Our next lessons will go into the other 3 books.